Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. You're watching Alaska Weather on this 3rd of October, and we thank you for joining us here tonight. We've got a lot of important information we want to share with you about the weather that's changing around the Bering Strait, Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound, and all of our West Coast communities. So stay tuned for that. As always, we want to make sure that you have the very latest and easy-to-use ways to get your weather information where you are. The Alaska Weather Information Line is a great resource, 1-800-472-0391, our website, weather.gov/Alaska, and you can simply go to weather.gov/Fairbanks, weather.gov/Juneau, or weather.gov/Anchorage if you know which office serves you. If you don't, start here. This is an easy one. If you can't find what you're looking for, please let me know. I'm happy to serve you any way I can. I want to make sure that you've got the very best and latest information as we go. I want to start talking about the high wind warning first for St. Lawrence Island, Gamble, and Savunga. We've got high wind warning starting tonight, and that's going to go through at least Saturday. And it looks like 35 to 50 mile an hour sustained winds, gusts to 65. Now with that comes a surge of water that's coming in on that westerly flow. And it looks like we'll have a coastal flood advisory. What that means is coastal flooding is possible 3 to 5 feet above the normal high tide line there. So if you've got property down at the beach, tonight is the night to bring that up and do so quickly. Again, a coastal flood advisory posted for St. Lawrence Island. And now let's focus on the high winds that are moving into areas around Norton Sound. These won't be damaging winds that we believe will reach St. Lawrence Island, but we do think it's going to push a lot of water in. We'll have southwesterlies first, and then we'll have more of a northwesterly flow coming in much later at the tail end of the storm. But in between that, a very long duration westerly flow pushing water into Norton Sound. So let's start here. Around the southern Seward Peninsula coastline, you'll be one of the first places to see the water move in. A coastal flood warning is in effect there, and it looks like water could come up 5 to 8 feet above the normal high tide line. For the eastern Norton Sound region there, and that does include Shaktoolik, we would expect to see water coming up anywhere from 5 to 10 feet above the normal high tide line. So a coastal flood warning for you. And then down into the Yukon Delta, we expect to see water coming up 5 to 7 feet above the normal high tide line. So this entire region here looking at coastal flooding, right now it does look like we will see that happen as we get into Friday and then into Saturday there. So watch for that to start to change as early as tonight and overnight, certainly by tomorrow morning. Now areas shaded in yellow, this is an opportunity for coastal flooding as well. The impact should not be as great as what we're seeing around the Norton Sound region and Yukon Delta and the Seward Peninsula, but for the Kotzebue Sound region and the Chukchi Coast, coastal flood advisories are posted because water may come up 3 to 5 feet above the normal high tide line as we go Friday and into Saturday, maybe even into early Sunday morning. So a lot going on, and right now the Norton Sound region, St. Lawrence Island, and the Seward Peninsula look like there will be a very good opportunity for coastal flooding. So make sure you're doing your part, pulling property off the beach. Now, as we look up across the mountains, the areas shaded in red here are winter storm warnings. It is going to snow. From areas north of Ambler all the way out toward Red Dog Mine and north of Kiana, it looks like there's going to be some periods of potentially heavy snow, in fact, and we'll be surprised to see about 8 to 12 inches or so, maybe up to 14 in the upper parts of the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. It's going to come down pretty hard because that wind blowing very wet air right up into the higher terrain should make a very efficient snow machine. Now down in the lower parts of the valley, it looks like it might snow a little bit less, maybe 6 to 8 inches in general, maybe a few spots up to 10, but anything north of Ambler in the upper Kobuk there, probably going to get hammered with some heavy snow. As we look into the regions there across Bettles all the way up to the southeastern parts of the Brooks Range, this area probably looking at a better opportunity for about 5 to 10 inches of snow, maybe as much as 12. But again, this entire area here, if you're driving along the Dalton Highway, you're probably going to run into some periods of heavy snow and especially a slushy snow for the early season. A look further south, winter weather advisories there are posted for the Denali area as well as the eastern Alaska Range. We expect to see 6 to 10 inches of snow in the region, maybe as much as 12 as we go from Friday and onward into Saturday. So a lot going on as a new winter storm moves through, and this one does have the potential to be a coastal flood maker across the Norton Sound community, St. Lawrence Island, and into the Bering Strait and Chukchi Seacoast. So be advised, be careful, and have a way to monitor the storm as we go through. And as always, when it's safe to do so and the storm has passed and conditions are improving, we'd love to see what's going on in your community so we can do a better job here the next time around and make sure we understand what weather makes it bad in your community. So thank you very much in advance. Now, as far as things going better, a little bit of good news here. I like to round that out for you. The Drought Monitor, updated yesterday, shows improving conditions in southeast. So after all these waves of rain moving through, we are seeing an impact in a good way for southeast. You can see yellow areas here at D0. That's abnormally dry conditions, but the drought conditions kind of pick up a little bit more into moderate to severe drought as you head south of Petersburg. And the red area remains around Ketchikan, Heidelberg, and Annette. We're still talking about extreme drought here, but it is improving. So that's a good news here. You can also see lesser drought conditions around Palmer to Anchorage and the forelands there of the Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak. The extreme drought has been removed from the area. So good improvements there. If you are still looking and thinking about drought conditions and what that meant for you in your community, no matter where you are, the folks at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln would like to know about it. That helps all of us do our jobs better and understand what drought means to Alaskans, because this is not usual. So what they'd like you to do is go to droughtreporter.unl.edu/map. And if you click on Submit Report right here, you can log the impacts that you've seen in your community from drought conditions if you haven't done that already. They would appreciate that, and again, that helps all of us, all of Alaska, understand what some of these changes mean as we go forward into the next season. Here's a look at the satellite picture now. You can see this really strong Pacific jet blasting in across the Bering Sea. That's really going to be the playmaker as we move into the rest of the weekend here. It looks like this is driving in about 150 knot winds at the top, and down below it's reinforced by very fast moving winds, about 50 to 60 knots coming in from the west at 9,000 all the way down to 3,000 feet, and really helping to spin up this broad area of low pressure here across the Gulf of Anadyr and the Bering Strait in the coming hours. So as we get into tonight, we're going to expect that area of low pressure to really kind of ramp up and strengthen, which is going to drive in that southwesterly flow into the south-facing slopes of the Seward Peninsula and eventually into Norton Sound. And then as this system moves a little bit further northward, we'll get into more of that westerly flow, which will really start to push the water into parts of Norton Sound. The tail end of this weather system will bring in a northwesterly flow, and that's when parts of the Yukon Delta will see a better chance of flooding. Some of that could also impact areas down into the Kuskokwim region, as well as places like Newtok. You could see the water come up there. No advisories for you at this point, though. Now, low pressure just west of the Bering Strait is on our map for this afternoon. You can see the tail end of showers leaving southeast, but things are really drying out there and for south central as a ridge of high pressure is kind of shoving in a little bit more dry weather into the Gulf for the meantime. Now, pockets of rainfall are found out across the middle Tanana Valley, surrounding Fairbanks into the northern parts of the Yukon, and already we can see the preliminary parts of the storm bringing in warm and wet weather to the Seward Peninsula and the Yukon Delta and the lower valley itself. As we get into tonight, that system's going to intensify to about 980 millibars. We'll still have rain across parts of Southwest and Norton Sound, but just to the north, maybe even right around Nome to St. Lawrence Island, you'll see that switch over to a rain and snow mix. And that should tell you that that westerly cool weather is starting to blow through and the winds should start to pick up. Snow will begin across the Brooks Range, and some of that again could be heavy at times. Looking for some places to see as much as a foot as we go into the next 48 hours there. And some of that snow will also make its way into the Alaska Range initially. Now as we get into Friday and Saturday, that should pick up. The front will pass through the central and western parts of the interior, and snow will be a sure thing across the Brooks Range and all the way out toward the Seward Peninsula. But as we get into Norton Sound, that still could be a rain and snow mix. But notice how these lines are kind of west to east. That's really going to allow that strong westerly flow to push water into Norton Sound and eventually into the Yukon Delta. There's another wave of cooler air back behind this, and as that comes around, that will bring us that northwesterly flow that will eventually focus the winds on parts of the Yukon Delta. Now, not to be missed is this low pressure system passing over south central Alaska. As this works over the Kenai Peninsula, the Anchorage area, and the Matanuska and Susitna valleys, we'll probably see some periods of heavier rainfall across the northern Gulf. Still looking fairly dry in southeast out ahead of that, but don't be surprised to see snow and some of that heavy at times across the eastern Alaska Range. Rainfall stretches through Kodiak Island and parts of southwest. As we get into Saturday, that low pressure system really isn't moving out very quickly, and as it does that, it's going to drag in colder air. And I would not be surprised to see some snow around the Anchorage hillside especially up above most of the homes there. So we're talking about Hillside Drive and maybe higher into the Flat Top and some of the Chugach, maybe up into Arctic Valley, and probably up into the Chugach around the Eagle River region. So if you've got driving plans or if you've got some flying plans, keep in mind that conditions may be kind of low Saturday morning and you're going to see some new snow. Doesn't look like we're going to see a good opportunity for a whole lot of snow on most of the road systems around South Central. Not just yet. Across southeast, periods of rainfall will develop, and across the north, periods of moderate to occasionally heavy snow showers will remain possible as the system's moving through. And as we look at the Yukon Delta, this is when we set up that northwesterly flow that could bring coastal flooding into your area and continue the push of water into Norton Sound all the way through Saturday. Back to the west, we expect to see periods of rain moving through that region. Again, as warmer air starts to return to the area. Looking at temperatures tonight, 30s and 40s in southeast, overnight lows around the Bristol Bay region back in the mid-40s, Kodiak staying mild at 45, the Copper River Valley and the upper Tanana Valley in the upper 20s, a few places might near 30 degrees, 25 for AKwx Pass, 20s and 30s for the North Slope, the Seward Peninsula in the mid to upper 30s. High temperatures tomorrow still mild out ahead of the weather, 40s and 50s for Southwest, Hooper Bay around 43, Bethel 47, Nome 39, Utqiagvik looking at 38, and Kaktovik 37, 41 in Fort Yukon. Middle Tanana Valley in the lower 40s, 50s for South Central, Kodiak 56, and low to mid 50s for Southeast. Overnight lows Saturday morning start to cool off significantly. Teens and 20s for the higher train of the Brooks Range, 37 around, Golovin, 34 for Unalakleet, 33 in Galena. Southwest still holding around 40 degrees, even milder south and west. South Central in the mid-30s, southeast in the 40s, and high temperatures are much cooler on Saturday afternoon in the north.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to aviation weather now. As that storm system comes in across the northern Bering, it's going to have a lot of moisture in front of it. That should lower ceilings all the way from the Kuskokwim Delta and the Kuskokwim Mountains all the way back to the central and western chain, at least with IFR. Widespread marginal conditions across the Brooks Range where snow will be heavier. We'll see IFR conditions lingering there, including areas around Arctic Village and north of Fort Yukon. But notice again the widespread marginal conditions spreading into Tenita Pass, Cook Inlet, and down to just south of Lake Iliamna toward Naknek and King Salmon, but not all the way down the Alaska Peninsula, so good news there. For most of the Gulf, things will be VFR. Look for some lingering MVFR around Hyder and just east of Ketchikan, and then all the way up the Alcan border. The Beaufort Seacoast also looking at least a little bit of marginal conditions generally from Kaktovik westward to about Prudhoe Bay. As we go through the day, look for some more improvements there across the North Slope. Marginal conditions lingering right along the Beaufort Seacoast all the way west to about Point Barrow before it goes well offshore. IFR lengthens a little bit to the west along the Brooks Range south-facing slopes. Marginal conditions there across the interior as well as Fairbanks. All the way down into the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound. Southeast still holding out for VFR and IFR conditions south and west of St. Paul and St. George all the way through the central and eastern chain. As we get into Saturday morning, IFR will linger around the upper Koyukuk in the middle Yukon Valley. The north-facing slopes looking for VFR, but marginal conditions all the way around our coastal villages. South and west look for IFR concerns mainly from Cape Newenham west to just about the Pribilofs. Up and down the west coast, though, lingering marginal conditions. The wind will likely be your largest issue. Southeast starts to run into more marginal weather as we get into the morning hours. IFR around Chilkoot and White Pass, just about to Juneau, and then once again around Hyder and east of Ketchikan and Annette. For the afternoon, look for the IFR concerns to spread out along the higher terrain for southeast. Marginal conditions continue around the Gulf, most of south central, southwest, the interior, north, with the exceptions of the upper Tanana and the upper Yukon valleys, likely looking at completely MVFR conditions. Most of the North Slope will see VFR on the north side of your passes there, but coastal areas still looking at marginal conditions with IFR lurking again off the Beaufort Seacoast. Here's your pass conditions for your Friday. IFR expected in Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass as we go through your afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, we expect to see marginal weather there. Rainy Pass, marginal conditions, as well as Windy Pass on into Isabel Pass for the afternoon, though we do expect to see an IFR start for your day. Mentasta Pass, expect to see VFR heading over to marginal conditions for your Friday. Tonita Pass, also looking for marginal weather throughout your day. Portage Pass, VFR, but leaning over toward marginal weather as we go throughout your afternoon. And right now, Chilkoot and White Pass look to be A-OK with VFR expected for your Friday, and of course that will change as we get into Saturday. As the weather system moves in across the northern Bering, colder air is dropping southward, and you can see a really tight temperature gradient here across the western Bering Sea coast, all the way from about 2,000 feet around Hooper Bay to about 8,000 to 10,000 feet around Bristol Bay, and out across the central chain, levels come up to as high as 12,000 feet. And there's plenty of cool air that's making its way into the interior. Levels are running around 2,000 feet and just below north of the Brooks Range, about 2,000 to 4,000 feet across the central and western interior, and about 2,000 to 4,000 feet all the way down toward Chilkoot and White Pass. South of that, most of southeast is holding between 4,000 and 6,000 feet. And we are seeing more changes in the icing potential as well. Levels for isolated moderate running around 3,000 to 4,000 feet around the Seward Peninsula, Kotzebue and Norton Sound included, above 6,000 feet across the North Slope, and then cooling off a little bit and lowering for the eastern interior all the way down to Prince William Sound, about 5 to 7 feet there, and southern parts of southeast holding around 8,000 feet and above. Out to the west, the colder air rebounding just a little bit, and levels are going back up to about 7,000 feet over the Bering. The jet stream is really going to move a lot of weather our way and very quickly over the next 6 to 7 days. And as this is making more of a west to easterly path right into Alaska, these wind speeds are really going to be key in stirring up the weather. Right now, they look like they'll run around 135 to 150 knots. The Pacific jet is just to the south. You can see that spinning up here in the Gulf, and another trough across the west. But as long as this is making a beeline into Alaska, we are going to get weather changes one right after the other. 9,000 feet, you can see a very broad area of low pressure shaping up over the Chukchi. Wind speeds coming into the west coast, 40 to 55 knots. Westerlies stronger into southeast, and southwesterlies over the eastern interior, 30 to 50 knots. And a very similar pattern here at 3,000 feet. The strongest winds right along the west coast, 30 to as much as 50 knots. Turbulence potential then will be going up around Norton Sound and some of our interior mountains below 4,000 to 6,000 feet. Chop for the north slope, but considerable moderate will be widespread across the west coast, the Alaska Peninsula, into south central Alaska, Kodiak, and the Kenai Peninsula included.
Perseus and the Seven Sisters. Hey there, stargazers. I'm Dehne Regas, astronomer from the Cincinnati Observatory.
And I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida. Autumn is finally here, and there's a very special constellation that's going to be making its reappearance in the evening sky.
That's right, James. Perseus the hero is back. And not only is he associated with a great story in the sky, but he also has some interesting celestial company.
What are we talking about? Let's show you.
Okay, we've got our skies set up for this week at 11 p.m. facing northeast. If you look more to the east, you'll see what looks like a tiny little dipper-shaped cluster of stars, the beautiful Seven Sisters. Now, most people can see only 6 stars here with the naked eye, but if you have really good eyesight or are wearing thick glasses like 4 Eyes over there, you may see 7.
And with a pair of binoculars, you can see several dozen. In reality, however, there are over 250 stars here, all much larger than our own sun and burning much, much hotter. Cosmically speaking, they're not very distant, only 400 light years away, which means we see the Pleiades not as they exist now, but as they existed 400 years ago. At about the same time, Galileo trained a telescope on them and discovered them to be a family of dozens of suns.
Nearby, we have the double cluster, which is in the constellation Perseus. First, look up and to the right of the North Star, where you'll see the 5 stars that trace out the M-shaped constellation of Cassiopeia the Queen. The double cluster is down and to the right of Cassiopeia, and you probably will need binoculars to see them. But if you are far away from city lights, you'll notice that they are embedded in the river of light we call the Milky Way.
The double cluster of Perseus might not look like much at first, but each cluster has about 100 more stars than the Pleiades. The reason they aren't as bright as the Pleiades is because they are a whopping 7,000 light years away, much further away than the Pleiades, which means we see them not as they exist now, but as they existed 7,000 years ago.
However, like the Pleiades, the double cluster also consists of super hot blue-white stars, and through a small telescope you may be able to detect a few much cooler red ones.
And imagine, if you can, what the twin clusters of Perseus would look like if they could be magically positioned in our skies as close as the Seven Sisters are. They'd be a dazzling sight to see.
Speaking of dazzling stars, there are two in Perseus that we want you to check out. Let's head back to the Earth.
Okay, we still have our skies set to 11 p.m., and at the center of the constellation Perseus, you'll see a star named Mirfak. Mirfak is Arabic for elbow.
Looks more like his chest to me, but anyway, to the right of Mirfak, we see Perseus holding something in his outstretched arm. To the ancient Greeks, it's the star Algol, aka the winking eye of Medusa. She's the one with snakes for hair that could turn you to stone with one look.
But other cultures had some very frightening names for this star, like the Spectre's Head, Ghost's Head, Satan's Head, the Double Eye, and Dean's personal favorite, Piled Up Corpses. Why such scary names?
Well, Algol is no ordinary star. It's a special type of star called an eclipsing variable. Algol is really two stars that orbit each other. When the bigger, dimmer star blocks the light of the smaller, brighter star, Algol dims like clockwork every 2.87 days.
Perseus is using Medusa's head to save Princess Andromeda from the sea monster constellation Cetus. Look farther to the southeast and maybe you can make out the sea monster.
His outline looks more like a recliner chair.
Nevertheless, this was Poseidon's vicious pet sea monster who we see turned to stone by
Medusa's head!
Algol strikes again.
So, go outside and check out the Pleiades.
And the double cluster of Perseus along with Mirfak his elbow.
And Algol, the winking eye of Medusa. It's all there when you keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And back with your marine weather now. No new sea ice to report. There are some minor areas that are growing a little bit in that ice pack itself, but nothing anywhere close to shore. Again, apologies for our sea ice graphic here. Some new upgrades we're working on will improve our graphics back to their normal quality as we go. But this is the type of image you'll see if you head to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. And you can check on concentration and as well as thickness and the general forecast over the next 5 days. Here's a look at what southeast looks like tomorrow. Winds should be light and seas should be small. On the inside, for the most part, Stevens Passage and parts of the Clarence Strait looking pretty good. The Lynn Canal still looking at southerlies 20 knots with 4-foot seas and a gentle onshore flow in the north, 10 to 15 knots. Northwesterlies down the southern outer coast with 5-foot seas there on 10 knots. As we get into Saturday, you can see seas are building out across the Gulf as the next wave of weather develops around the Kenai Peninsula. Westerlies at 25 knots coming into Icy Cape and Cape Fairweather, into Cross Sound. More of a southwesterly flow south of Port Alexander and into the Dixon entrance, 15 to 20 there. 5 to 7-foot seas are expected. And stronger southerly winds will develop on the inside with gusts to 50 knots around the Lynn Canal. 35 sustained, 7-foot seas on that wind, and you're looking at 4 to 5-foot seas to the south, gust to 45 in Stevens Passage. Saturday will be a lot different. As we look at South Central on Friday, southwesterlies are coming up ahead of that wave of low pressure. 25 to 35 knots on the inside here, looking at 10 to 12-foot seas in the north. Southwesterlies also building across the northern Gulf. Southerlies at 20 inside of Prince William Sound with a 4-foot sea, and 5 to 6-foot seas here, maybe as much as 8 on the eastern Barrens with a 25-knot wind on Friday. For Saturday, winds are still high. They're around the north and western Gulf, 25 to 35. Northerlies around the Prince William Sound region, 3-foot seas. West and southwesterlies around Cook Inlet, 15 to 25. Expect 3 to 6-foot seas there on Saturday. A little bit of improvement in a few spots. For Friday, it's going to be a windy day in Bristol Bay. A west and southwesterly flow there with 10 to 11-foot seas, 30-knot winds expected across the north and western Gulf. You can see 20 to 25, looking for 8-foot seas in most areas, but 10-foot seas are expected inside of Shelikof Strait with that southwest wind to 30. Look for more of a northwesterly shift as we get into Saturday. Following the frontal passage there, seas and winds will remain on the higher side. 10 to 12-foot seas expected for Bristol Bay, up to 30-knot winds, and 25 to 30 for the north and western Gulf. 7-foot seas in Shelikof Strait, so improvement there. And westerlies off of the Shumagins and all the way up toward AKwx, expecting 9 to 10-foot seas in general on Saturday. For the Aleutians, a west and southwesterly flow will be blowing. Again, this shouldn't be the place where we see most of the wind this weekend. A front will be approaching from the area, so look for seas and the winds to be a little choppy at times. 9 to 10 foot seas in general, and 20 to 30 knot winds coming in from the west and southwest. You can see things improving for AKwx all the way out toward Kiska and Shemya as we go into your Saturday. The strongest winds will be for the central and eastern chain, 20 to 25, 5 to 8 foot seas in the south, and 6 to 9 foot seas there across the Bering Sea coast with 25 knots north of Unalaska, and westerlies there from Kiska to AKwx, only 10 knots with a 5 foot sea. On Friday, we're watching those westerly winds really pick up into the Yukon Delta, Norton Sound, and the south-facing shores of the Seward Peninsula. 35 to 40 knot winds are expected, 9 to 12 foot seas in most areas, maybe as much as 15 south of St. Lawrence Island and into the Bering Strait, as well as St. Matthew Island. St. Paul and St. George, you're looking at 30 knot winds from the west with a 13 foot sea, becoming northwesterly on Saturday, 9 foot seas there, and west and northwesterly winds will be picking up into the Yukon Delta, and we do expect to see coastal flood warnings continuing for the region there. Again, more on that in just a minute. Across the Beaufort Seacoast, easterlies driving at 20 to 30 with 6 to 7 foot seas there in the open water. Easterlies across the Chukchi Sea, 8 to 9 foot seas on 30 knot winds with a southwesterly flow coming into Kotzebue Sound. Again, a coastal flood advisory is posted for you. Southerlies on Saturday, 25 knots there with a 10 foot sea. Looks like westerly winds working through the Beaufort, 7 foot seas on a 20 knot wind, and a little bit more of an offshore flow around Point Lay at 10 knots. Recapping tonight's weather, we're watching a strong and strengthening storm moving across the Bering Strait. It is going to produce a lot of snow for the Brooks Range, the Kobuk and Noatak valleys, as well as the eastern Alaska Range and Denali. All of those areas have either a winter storm warning or a winter weather advisory for snowfall that could reach up over a foot in some cases. Our main concern, though, is coastal flooding, especially from the south-facing shores of the Seward Peninsula into Norton Sound and the Yukon Delta. We're watching for coastal flooding that could reach upwards of 5 to as much as 10 feet above normal high tide. Make sure you check your local weather conditions for the specifics for your community. Places like Shaktoolik should be on guard. A colder air mass is dropping south into Norton Sound. That will push the winds into more of a northwesterly direction as we get into Saturday. The Yukon Delta will experience higher flood potential at that point, and Kotzebue Sound also looking at the potential for higher water. Watching for snow in the southern mountains, the Chugach could see the first round of snowfall as we get into Saturday afternoon. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.